Hello again and welcome back to another video. Today we're talking about the best camera settings for cinematic video on the Canon M50. The reason why I wanted to make this video is I see a lot of people just picking up their camera and hitting record. And I ask them, why does the footage look grainy? Or why is it flickering? Or why is this, why is that? And they just look at me and go, I don't know, I just hit record. I just picked it up and started recording. And that annoys the heck out of me. Because before you even get into the whole, getting the right angle, getting the right movement, the right action out of your talent or whatever it is, you've already set yourself up for a loss because your settings are completely wrong and you cannot fix this in post. This is not photography where it's one frame that is a raw file that you can manipulate the heck out of. This is a coded, baked image on the file that's final. There's very minimal things that you can do to it, so you have to get it right in the shot. Unless you're shooting on a $30,000 Red or an ARRI Alexa and you're shooting in RAW, you have a bit of leeway there. But if you have one of those cameras, you probably have a fully hectic setup. You're pretty much completely manipulating the light in your scene to make it as perfect as you can on camera before you even do any editing anyway, which is what people with cameras like me that can't shoot in RAW have to do. Like, absolutely have to do this. So this is just basic 101 video on what settings you should be using. Now, first things first, know what region you're in. If you're in America, you're in an NTSC region. Me living here in Australia, this is a PAL region. So you should set your camera accordingly. The reason for that is not just this is how TV is displayed in Australia or this is how it's displayed in whatever other region you live in. The refresh rates of lights are different in different regions. So for example, if I was to shoot in NTSC right now, you'd either see flickering from the lighting that's on here right now, it's either on me or lighting the wall behind me, or you'd see like banding lines coming down, especially when you're shooting anything that's lit up by artificial light, or when you're filming LED screens, computer screens, and TVs, you'd see these banding lines or flickering. That is because everything in PAL regions are displayed at different refresh rates as they are in NTSC regions. Even if you were to change your frame rate and shutter speed accordingly, you could never really completely get rid of that. Which now leads me to my next thing, frame rates. So most of the time, pretty much 100% of the time, movies are displayed in 24 frames a second. This is just the most cinematic look. It's got the right motion blur. But for me, living in Australia, this is a PAL region, so I shoot in PAL. We get 25 frames a second instead of 24 on the Canon EOS M50. Now, the only reason that you should be shooting in the high frame rates, like either 50 frames a second or 100 frames a second, is if you intend to slow that footage down later in post. You shouldn't really shoot in 50 frames a second and then just display it in real-time motion. Now, I understand if you're vlogging, run and gun kind of stuff, I get that. I do the same thing. I'll just keep it on 50 frames. But if you're trying to get the most cinematic look, if you're shooting for a cinematic style video, that is how you get the best look. You shoot in 25 frames a second, or you shoot in 50 frames so you could halve it, or you shoot in 100 frames so you can slow it down to 25%. Now, the next thing is shutter speed. This is something that I see a lot of photographers that now start taking videos really just kind of brush this rule over their head because they don't actually know. You don't know any better photographers. I'm sorry. I'm kidding, of course. That is really mean. Oh, wow. The reason being is for photographers, the shutter speed is usually one of the first things you change when you're trying to alter the amount of light in your image. Of course, if you want to have a really nice shallow depth of field, you would open your iris all the way up. You want to keep your ISO as low as possible. So those are the two things you want to touch last. So your shutter speed is usually what determines your light. And if you really want a really shallow depth of field and you're shooting at 1.4, 1.8, or f2, you're really letting a lot of light into your sensor, so everything's blown out. So you bump your shutter speed right up to really reduce the light coming into your image. Now, that's great for photos because it's a still image. There's no motion in this. But for videos, it's literally a motion picture. In a video, if you do have your shutter speed really fast, it makes everything look jittery because there's no blur. There's no motion blur in any movement. And sometimes, I don't know if you've ever seen footage where the shutter speed's real high, but it almost gives you motion sickness because nothing's blurry. But motion blur really adds to the cinematic look, and that is what you want, and you don't want your audience getting car sick or motion sickness watching your video. So what shutter speed should your shutter be set at? So the general rule of thumb is the 180-degree rule. This is a film term that's used in the film industry. It's pretty much just saying that the shutter angle should be 180 degrees relative to the frame rate. That is only something you see in film cameras. You'll see that your shutter speed can be set to 180 degrees, 270, 360 degrees. That kind of means nothing to anyone that's shooting on SLRs or mirrorless cameras. So all that means to us is our shutter speed needs to be double the frame rate. If your frame rate's 25 frames a second, your shutter speed should be at 1/50th. If you're at 50 frames a second, your shutter speed should be at 1/100th. If you're shooting super slow-mo at 100 frames a second, your shutter speed should be at 1/200ths. Yes, 1/200ths if you're at 100 frames per second. That's right. If you do live in the NTSC regions and you are shooting at 24 frames a second, I understand that some cameras cannot make their shutter speed 1/48th of a second. So instead, 1/50th for you guys is close enough. So now you ask, what if you're shooting in broad daylight, where you can't control the sun, you don't have money to buy diffusers that are big enough to cover your house? What do you do there? Even if you are shooting in sunset, if you have your f-stop at f1.8 or 1.4 and you really want that shallow depth of field, but it's letting way too much light in and you don't want to break the 180-degree rule and your ISO can't go any lower than 100, what do? You've got to get what's called an ND filter. So this is what you call a variable ND filter. ND just stands for neutral density. So all these things really are just sunglasses for your camera. Now, what I was saying with this one, it's a variable ND. So this ND you can literally adjust on the fly. So just plain ND filters, they are just a set tint, you could call it, and you can't change it. They're just always set that way. So you can get a pack of 4 or 5 and they're at different intensities of darkness, you could say. But this one is an all-in-one ND filter. So if you can see here, when I twist it, it gets darker, and then when I twist it back, it gets lighter again. This is so good for run and gun because when you just have this on your lens and things get a bit brighter or darker as they go, you can just change the adjustment on the fly, especially when you're shooting things like weddings or live events. You can't just stage things. You've got to be able to run and gun on the fly. So these things are awesome, but they stop you from cranking up that shutter speed and getting jittery image, or closing your f-stop to a ridiculously high number and the whole scene is in focus and you're not getting any depth of field. This thing will help you keep your settings true to the cinematic look. I am going to release a video in the future specifically talking about how to expose your shots, where I will also show you guys how to use this to do so. So that's it from me. I hope this video was helpful to you. If you did like it, leave a thumbs up, leave a comment. I do like replying to you guys, so please do just comment a question, ask me anything. I'll get back to as many of you as I can, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. I hope I see more of you guys using the right settings. That means a lot to me, so please do so, and I'll see you guys in the next video.